Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and I'm glad to have you along for our journey today. Today, we're going to be looking at the last 6 months, 7 months since this coronavirus hit, since the beginning of 2020. It's been quite a year. We're already here past Labor Day now for 2020. I wanted to take a little time to evaluate where we've been so far as Christians and the Christian church. And I wanted to look at 3 areas where I think that as Christians and as the Christian church, especially our leadership, has really dropped the ball in 2020. This has been a year of testing. There's no question about that. We have been tested in so many ways. Individually, we've been tested. As families have been tested. Every single structure and system in this country, from government to economics, business, education, arts and science, every area, and especially the church, has been under pressure and has been tested like never that we've seen in our lifetimes. So I wanted to go over 3 areas where I felt that as Christians, our church leadership and as the body of Christ, we've really dropped the ball. We've got to do better, and we can do better. We just need to recognize that much of Christianity has made some mistakes during this time of testing, and so not all of it, not all the leaders and not all the churches and not all Christians have fallen into these temptations, but a lot of times Christianity under stress in this country has failed in a couple of ways. So let's go over 3 ways. And the first big way is the lack of serious spiritual reflection and grappling and thinking about the coronavirus. The pandemic hits the entire world, starts in China, spreads out. We see it going into Italy, for example, a month or so ahead of when it came to the U.S. We saw a lot of deaths in Italy. And you would think that because as Christians, we have the Bible, we have 2,000 years of Christian history, we have some of the greatest thinkers on the planet Earth, theologians, we have access to the theological seminaries and theological colleges. We have some of the best colleges in the world and seminaries and universities in the world, and so many Christian professors. You would think that there would have been a serious grappling with the meaning and purpose of this coronavirus, but really what we see from most Christian thinkers, most Christian theologians, most Christian leaders, what we see is dead silence, just silence, no comment, or I have no clue as to what's going on, they say. And even the ones that do speak up, there seems to be a lack of gravitas. There seems to be a lack of seriousness and really a very superficial analysis of what's taking place. For example, we saw this in the infamous article in Time magazine by theologian N.T. Wright of England, who basically says, as Christians, we don't have a response to the coronavirus other than to just weep with those who weep and to lament and feel bad. But we really don't have any spiritual interpretation. We have no spiritual insight. It's just something that has happened, and we just have to be as helpful and as loving and as kind as we can to those in need and do our best to help alleviate the suffering that is on the planet Earth right now. So basically, no spiritual insight from him, no spiritual reflection, no meaning, no purpose. This has nothing that we can actually learn from. There are no lessons to be learned. There's no theology to be gained or learned from. It's happening, and we just have to be as useful and helpful as we can. That's N.T. Wright. So that's so shallow, and that's so So disappointing coming from supposedly an evangelical or neo-evangelical theologian, someone who is semi-Bible believing, and although very unorthodox in areas of what he believes. So, and that's about it. I mean, there really hasn't been anyone who has really stood up other than Joseph Pippa from the Reformed Theological Seminary. And he has basically, I think, given the best essay on the coronavirus. And that is basically God is trying to get the attention of a sinful world and trying to get people to reflect on him, to reflect on their sins, and to come back to him. And I totally agree. I totally believe that God is doing something with this coronavirus. He's trying to get our attention. He's trying to bring us to repentance. He's trying to shake up our world. There's no question about that. And there's so much that can be delved into. There's so much that can be explored as far as the meaning and purpose of this coronavirus. You know, when we look over the world, especially the Western nations, the traditional Christian Western nations, and how much we've fallen away from God, the institutions, not just the churches, have definitely fallen away by and large, not preaching the strong gospel that is found in the Bible, but sort of a watered-down, wishy-washy, civil, cultural religion. Easy, goes down easy to live with, easy to sit through the sermons. Everything's light, fluffy, happy, positive. There's none of the seriousness that the early church had, as we see in the Bible, grappling with the great questions of life. There's so much, and this whole coronavirus could have prompted some of the greatest theologians and greatest minds in the Christian world to reflect deeply on this and say, people, it's a time to reflect on the brevity of life. God is wanting us to reflect on how short life is and what really matters and what are our priorities in life. We could delve into the area of idolatry and how we've made the blessings that we experience here in the Western nations, in the Christian West, into idols. We've taken money and made it into an idol, and a standard of living, we've made it into an idol. We've made sports and recreation into an idol, television, internet into an idol. We're so distracted from God. So there's just so much, and you could write an entire book on the lessons that God might be teaching the church and Christianity and the culture in general from the coronavirus, and why in his providence and his sovereignty he might have allowed this or even produced this directly in order to accomplish some spiritual, moral end in mind that he has. But no, for the most part, it's been very silent. The only thing that we get from most Christian leaders is just we need to lament with those who lament. We need to sympathize. We need to try to cry with those who are crying, and just be pastoral in the sense of a counselor. And I do believe we need to do that, but there's a lot more that can be said, and Christians, the leadership has by and large not said much at all, which is sad. We've dropped the ball. So that's one area where we need to change. Second area is that we have totally, I think in the Christian West here in the United States, but even in other countries we see this, Christian leadership has failed in respect to the social unrest, the Black Lives Matter protests, riots, looting, burning, violence, murders, and the so-called racism, social justice, so-called white supremacy, white privilege, the whole SJW, social justice agenda that has taken advantage of the turmoil of the coronavirus and has gone to the streets and is basically blackmailing the public in the United States, blackmailing people, saying, you either push our radical liberal agenda, our radical social justice, so-called quote social justice agenda, or we will burn down your cities. We will occupy blocks of your cities. We will do this. We will murder. We will kill. We will do violence against you and your family and your property. We will intimidate you. When you're eating in a restaurant, we will come up to you and shout at you unless you raise the black power sign, and unless you shout the mantra that you support Black Lives Matter and BLM, and unless you march in the street. Your silence is violence, the slogan has been. And so there's been this whole intimidation. There's been the riots and violence and marches in the street to defund the police. And as a result of this bogus claim that the police are hunting down and killing black people, and that black people are not safe because the police are after them. They want to kill the black people. And there's racist police, and there's systemic racism in the police, and so on and so forth. And so we have cities, large major cities, debating the question. They're actually debating this seriously, whether to defund the entire police department, which is totally ridiculous. And what have Christian leaders and pastors and theologians and Christian professors at leading colleges and universities and leading Christian voices in our culture, what have they done? Well, they've either been silent for the most part, or they have capitulated to this mob, this Black Lives Matter mob. We've seen many of the large megachurches across this country basically jump on board to Black Lives Matter before they even looked into any of the issues that were being promoted by Black Lives Matter. I remember we've done videos in the past. I've done a couple videos in the last 4 or 5 months of leading megachurch pastors. As soon as the Black Lives Matter protesters hit the streets and the riots started, they automatically went into joining the bandwagon mode. And I remember one specifically, and I was very upset and disturbed to hear him say he's going to spend the next 4 or 5 weeks dealing with the systemic sin of racism in this country, because he says we as white people are guilty of racism, whether we even know it or not. We are guilty of white supremacy, whether we know it or not. And so he's going to basically, essentially browbeat his thousands and thousands of people in his megachurch and shame them into confessing their sins of racism and white supremacy, even though they can't even recall or remember doing any sins in that area. Now, we all have sins and we all have to confess our sins, but there's a difference between real guilt and fake guilt, false guilt. And it's a very unhealthy situation when you are succumbing to false guilt and false shame. And these pastors, and it isn't just a few, many pastors, we don't have the statistics right now. We don't have the information, and I can't give it to you because I don't even think there's been a study done among all of the denominations and all of the independent churches in this country. But there is a large percentage of pastors and denominations in this country that just simply bought into the Black Lives Matter social justice agenda, uncritical. They just bought into it, assumed that everything that people were marching for in the streets, the police brutality and racial racism and white supremacy and injustice and all this kind of rhetoric, they just bought into that and assumed that it was all true and started preaching sermons and teaching people who are white that they are not right with God. They need to repent and join a protest or show their support to Black Lives Matter. In other words, so many Christian organizations and leaders and churches simply jumped into this without thinking it through, without looking at the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation, if you look at the data, if you look at statistics, if you look at reality, the reality is that police are not hunting down black people to kill them. They are not picking on or looking for trouble with black people. They encounter per capita more black men in criminal situations, and therefore there are more confrontations between police and black men than, say, per capita white men. And that's due to the high crime rate in the inner cities. It isn't because policemen are racist. I'm sure there are racist cops, just like there are racist everywhere, all over. But it isn't a systemic problem, and there is no evidence that it is. If you look at these people who have been lionized and they have been made martyrs, and they have posters up and role models in the social justice movement, these are, for the most part, 99% thugs, criminals, violent offenders who were being arrested at the time of their injury or death, and they are then the cause of these riots and marches and protests because supposedly there's some injustice taking place. And instead of letting the investigation go forth, the marchers and the protesters and Antifa terrorist rioters have just taken to the streets and assumed some narrative that whatever helps their cause. And this is wrong. It's not the right way to go about getting justice. It has nothing to do with Martin Luther King. He never would have okayed this. He was for peaceful protest, and he was protesting against real Jim Crow racism. When you see people marching in the streets today against policemen, that's a bogus justice cause. There is no injustice. The police are not picking on black people. They're not picking on racial minorities. They are trying to do their job in a very difficult situation. But Christian leaders, many pastors of especially large churches, in an effort to sort of buy in, be popular, go with the flow, join the latest fad, join the latest fashion. They read the political winds and said, okay, I'm going to jump in and be for this cause without even thinking it through. And that is a spiritual, harmful thing to do. And so Christians, in respect to this whole SJW, Black Lives Matter, so-called racial injustice, so-called white supremacy, that whole social unrest that we're seeing on the news every day, in respect to that, Christians and the churches, for the most part, have totally dropped the ball on that. And it didn't have to be that way. There could have been very wise and very nuanced and very deliberate thinking done by all of the so-called theologians we have in the church, the professors at all of these Christian universities and colleges, and all the Christian leaders we have running around voicing their opinions on every issue, and all the pastors. There could have been a very godly, biblical response to this, but only a few voices have really done that. For the most part, it's either been silence or it's been advocacy for it. So that's another area where Christians during this pandemic have really failed to take up the biblical Christian faith and apply it to our culture today. And finally, we have witnessed an unprecedented capitulation and submission to ungodly powers and ungodly authorities, imposing themselves on the Christian church in the form of so-called health restrictions and so-called building and public meeting policies that have basically come against Christianity and prevented them from actually holding church services for many, many months, way beyond what is necessary. And now, even still, we're coming up on 6 months and going past 6 months now. Even now, we're still facing sort of draconian power grabs by liberal Democratic blue state mayors and governors and county officials and city officials to prevent Christians from even worshiping and functioning in groups. And we're seeing actually persecution of pastors who would dare just open the doors of the church on Sunday morning in the midst of a overblown and overhyped danger level of the coronavirus. We see, for example, out in California, Pastor John MacArthur, a pastor of a large church of maybe 5, 6, 7,000 members. And as last reported, he has not seen, known of, or heard of even one person in his congregation who has gotten sick and gone to the hospital with coronavirus. And they have been meeting now for at least a month in their large building and gathering seating normally as they would on a Sunday morning, because they looked at the data, they looked at the deaths, they looked at the cases, they looked at the danger level, and they concluded, along with some other experts that they're hearing, that it is safe for churches to meet on Sunday morning. And so they had church services, and the county of Los Angeles wants to shut them down. They're trying to fine them. They're trying to intimidate them. They're trying to take away parking lot space. They're trying to do everything they can to stop Pastor John MacArthur from meeting on Sunday morning in a country that has a First Amendment that says we have freedom of religion, and the LA County wants to shut that down. Now, most churches in the beginning of this epidemic, back in March, looked at the situation and said this could possibly be a very dangerous virus. And so, on the side of caution, let us stop meeting for a time, maybe a month or two, so that we can understand this virus more, understand how it spreads, understand how to prevent it spreading, and just understand what we're dealing with. It was a new and novel virus. We didn't know the risks, and we didn't know the threat it posed. And so you err on the side of caution. And so that's what most churches and pastors did. They erred on the side of caution. And so there was almost 100% unanimity of not meeting for a couple months, so that we could flatten the curve, as our experts ask us to do. We want to make sure that the health systems are not overrun. And so churches were closed, and their church services were confined to digital, internet, online television services. A very crippling way to do church, but at least there was some semblance of church. Okay, the curve was flattened after the first couple months. We began to learn more about the virus. We began to learn how it's transmitted and the risk to age groups and so on and so forth. And then after that, more churches, especially smaller churches, began to open their services for public meetings with masks on. And then there began more and more openings of churches and so forth. And it seems to be okay. But there were spots around the country where blue state, Democratic, liberal, far leftists refuse to let churches meet as normal. And I recall, for example, in Michigan, the state where I was born and raised in, the governor there has so many restricting policy guidelines and laws that forbid Christians to meet. And it's crippling the churches in Michigan. And that's just one state. There are all kinds of states. California is another state that is crippling Christianity in California because these churches cannot meet. And it seems to be the case that these blue state governors, mayors, county officials don't care how much the church is damaged. In fact, from the attitude of a lot of them, it seems like they would really hope that this epidemic might just put a lot of churches out of business. They don't have any use for these churches because they themselves are ungodly unbelievers, and they don't care about church meetings, and they don't care about God's people gathering on Sunday morning like they're commanded to. But the leadership failure in Christianity has been that a great many pastors and a great many denominational leaders and a great many influential Christian voices in this country and in the Western world, very few have stood up to the tyrannical policies of these blue state Democratic leaders and have said, no, we will not abide by your tyranny. We will meet as Christians in our churches, and we will stand up to you because you are a minister, you are a servant of God as a political leader, but you cannot violate the Lord's command for his people to go to church. And there's no health reason for it. There's no scientific reason for it. It's just simply a power grab. And very few ministers and denominational leaders and Christian voices have stood up and done that. Why? Because we have grown comfortable in our society. We have grown to be too friendly. Friendship with the world is enmity with God, says the New Testament. We have grown too comfortable in our situation in a secular society. And so we are loath and we are very cautious of actually criticizing those in power. And I would have to say there's often a little element of cowardice in it also, because there are pastors who say, well, we don't want to anger the authorities because they might do something bad and cause us trouble or pain or suffering or whatever. And I have to say that I respect pastors like John MacArthur who are standing up respectfully and saying, we want to obey the leaders, we want to conform to the laws and policies of our elected officials, but when they go overboard and they tell us we can't have church on Sunday morning, that is too much. And we have to say, no, we will not abide by those restrictive measures, and you have to do better than just simply be a dictator during a time of crisis and tell us what to do. You have to be willing to work within the Constitution, and our Constitution says we have the right to assemble, freedom of worship. We have the right to worship our God. It's a foundational, fundamental right in our country, and so we're going to exercise that right, even if it means jail. And that's what John MacArthur has said. Even if it means he has to go to jail, the church will remain open. We failed, generally speaking, as Christians to stand up. And so we have time to do better now. We can stand up to government tyranny. We can stand up to the fake and false social justice movement that's sweeping our nation and burning our cities. And we can also come up with a better understanding of what God might be doing with this coronavirus. And if we do that, I believe God will be pleased. Well, we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.